Tristan for this morning. I'm going to ask the questions and Tristan's going to respond. And then we're going to open the floor then. So if you've got any questions that you want to ask, you can either put them in the chat or you can ask them at the end of the call. Okay, so without any further ado, I'm going to go to the first question for you, Tristan. So as you know, the title of this module is ALN Excellence in Practice. And we'd like to know what you think, or if you're able to tell us what you think excellence in practice looks like from your perspective.
I think, okay, thanks, Rhiannon. Thanks for the introduction. I will just say before we go on, I'm not employed by Welsh Government. I'm employed by Carmarthenshire Council. Just clarity.
Okay.
So a lot of my work is with the Welsh Government, but I don't actually work for them. But yeah, the title is the right title. But yeah, so excellence in practice, I think in a school environment, I think we've got to be very, very mindful that ALN isn't an add-on to begin with. It's central to everything a school will do. So excellence within an ALN setting would be excellence within the whole school setting, if that makes sense, because it all is one big package, side by side with everything else a school would do. It's got to be entrenched in the well-being curriculum, the well-being sort of the pastoral side as well. It's got to be in the curriculum. It's got to be in all inclusion and everything a school will do. I suppose nuts and bolts of that, I suppose, would look things like the mechanisms, how do we support the most vulnerable learners? So I think all of you who are in any education setting these days will know that the levels of need are rising across from different needs, such as the dyslexia, the behaviour, the well-being, but the anxious non-attenders and all those as well. It's just getting a bigger picture at the moment. So you've got to put the mechanisms in place to support all those learners at all times. And it's been quite inventive at times, the lack of money and a lot of hard work has got to go into it. So you've got to be very, very inventive and creative. I think whole school training is key, and not just that training on the 1st, 2nd September. It's got to be regular whole school training about what's going on within the classes in school from an ALN perspective. I think when it does come to those ALN learners who do need extra support, it's identifying those children early. So it's good data tracking, it's good communication with teachers, pastoral staff, senior leaders to find trends and identify individuals within sometimes cohorts of 200-300 children who need that additional support, and filtering out possibly, I'm going to be careful how I say this because it might sound derogatory, but I don't mean it derogatory. Sometimes a child's ability, yes, they will need one kind of support, but maybe a child with a high ability and struggling with literacy will need a very different kind of support. So it's identifying and understanding the information given to you and filtering it all out. I think excellence has got to be part of that, is got to be the transitions. So I'm talking about transitions as you're coming up from reception and through the different classes, and then the different phases, transitions into high school, but also the transitions the other end, if there isn't a post-16 into college, and if there is a post-16, if there's into university, and make sure the children are getting onto the right courses. And that can be a very difficult conversation sometimes, because sometimes these children and young people haven't really got an understanding of what they can and can't do. So it's those very, very tactful and diplomatic conversations, really. Pupil voice, massive. I'm a massive believer in pupil voice. I try and get that, not necessarily formally, regularly, but I try and sit down with a number of pupils weekly just to get their view, what's going on, how is school, how is this department, how is that department, how is the ALN department supporting you, just to get a really good brief update on how things are going in the school. And they will be very honest with you. The children don't lie, really. Well, they lie if they do want to be caught out, but to you, they'll tell you exactly what's going on. One of the massive things I think, and this is possibly the biggest job an Elenco in a school has got, is parental engagement. If you get parents on board and get them engaged early on. And I think from my point of view, from a secondary point of view, year 7, get the parents in regularly, weekly, fortnightly. What you find is they start trusting you, and they will only contact you if there is a genuine problem. So a lot of work in early in the children's career in the school saves you a lot of work in the long term. And I think that's something I've from going in my traveling country in my new job. I think that's something I've seen quite clearly. If you haven't got that parental engagement and their trust, it causes you major issues further down the line. I think high quality IDPs as well. It's quite a new system at the moment, but I think if you've got your outcomes and your help and your description of needs really detailed and trackable and monitorable, and parents can see this progress, children can see this progress, I think it's a really, really good quality piece of work then, and that is excellence in itself. But that only comes with good agency workers as well, to input into those documents of the NHS, children's services, further things like counsellors and therapists, etc., etc. So I think all of that covers it really. But excellence in practice is a whole school thing in ALN, because ALN is not the bolt-on, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was going to ask you about parents, but then you preempted that. And also the idea of it's that ALNCO and that collaborative working and that multi-agency approach. You can't do it in isolation, can you? So in thinking about your former role, and I know you've left a secondary school relatively recently. I just wondered, how did you lead to ensure that excellence in your own setting? And have you got any examples of practice that maybe you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think one of the big things, I think you've got to understand your setting to begin with. And it's very difficult for someone, because I was only in this last school for 4 years. And I came in during COVID, but trying to understand the children, trying to understand the families, trying to understand the staff, that is really, really difficult. So you've got to get staff audits and things like that, going, talking to staff, understanding what they understand about ALN. And I suppose it was a different kettle of fish for me, because we were moving from a system to a new system. So I had to, what do you understand about the old system? What do you understand about the new system? What do you understand about the different needs that are emerging in the school? And then trying to work out what whole school staff training was urgently needed, and kind of create a programme of event for staff. I think that was quite a strong thing we had. One of the things which I was lucky, I was on the senior leadership team from day one when I got to the school. So things like a departmental improvement plan, I never had to produce, because it was in the school improvement plan. I had a line in the school improvement plan, but it was an everyone problem, not a my problem. So that was really important, and I think it's key. And I know the new code states that all Elencos should be either on the senior leadership or management, or have direct line of sight to it. I think that's absolutely essential. I think information sharing is important, because the children I used to deal with were the most vulnerable, but also the most difficult children in the school. And getting staff to understand the background, what's been going on in their lives, why the behaviour is like it is, what's happened within relationships in the family. Some of the children had seen awful things, safeguarding issues galore. So it's that information sharing, giving information, but receiving information as well, to try and work and formulate a plan. I think excellence is an open door policy. Staff have got to feel comfortable coming to visit me specifically, because they need to be able to share that information again, and not possibly have a really let it off their chest moment, because it can be so hard in a class of 30, 32, 34 when there's a number of difficult children in there. Excellent looks like training as well. And I'm talking about training for all levels. I'm talking about even training the head teacher, the senior leadership team on the different areas of what needs to be done. Obviously, there'll be varying training with different people, staff training, teacher assistant training. One of the things we had as a school was a very, very significant, large turnover then of teaching assistants. So I think in September, if I remember, we were close to the 30 mark teaching assistants, and I would say 25 of them were new. By the time I left in April, I think we had practically a completely new cohort of teaching assistants, and that's a year-on-year thing. We will so as a profession, I think there's an issue with teaching assistants because the pay is atrocious, in my opinion. There's no clear professional development apart from if you want to be in the teaching profession. But also, so that there's a recruitment issue in itself. But those you've got, not necessarily the best quality, and are young, which is the best thing sometimes, and normally past pupils. So you've got to put a really, really robust training package in place for them, because you could be facing all sorts of issues, safeguarding issues, and issues with the way they talk to children, because they're still children themselves in a way. I am saying that within those cohorts of teaching assistants, there are a lot of very, very good teaching assistants as well. Also, understanding my limitations. What can I train? What can't I train? What don't I? What am I not confident in? And getting people in, support networks in to support me and other people. I've mentioned partnership work, and I've mentioned transitions and early intervention. That's how we worked as a school, and it was a successful department and a successful school from regards to ALN.
So you've given us an overview of how you operated in your setting. How did you evaluate that? So if how did you evaluate that sort of elements of good practice, of excellence, and communicate this to others? Was that through training, or did you have other methods?
We had other mechanisms. So with the whole school had evaluation systems in place. So we'd monitor lessons. Again, it's not a bolster for every teacher is responsible for ALN. So within the teacher monitoring, the classroom monitoring, the subject monitoring, ALN was a clear focus all the time. Same as literacy would be, and numeracy would be. And then those were discussed regularly and fed back to staff where the strengths and weaknesses were. Any weaknesses I would deal with then, just in case there were training issues, things I hadn't noticed. So all senior leaders and all middle leaders were involved in that. So that was key. Communicated through emails and staff meetings and things like that, and the usual types of thing. I'd monitor my intervention sessions as well, to make sure they were high quality and the right information was being taught. So the local authority would support me monitoring stuff I would do. They would also monitor and evaluate our IDPs and our documentation that was going to local authority as well. So we'd have feedback every now and then about, oh, these are good, that needs more depth, etc., etc. So that was in place, and I could feed that back. With regards to my department within the school, we were a team of 5 teachers, which is quite an unusual situation to be in, to have so many teachers within an ALN department. So we had to set up similar systems like weekly meetings, senior team meetings, and things like that to feedback what was going well, what wasn't. And then I think the big one is data monitoring and tracking. But Rhiannon, you'll know my view on this. We've discussed this many a time, but data in a Welsh medium setting is non-existent, really, so it's really difficult. And I suppose that's where my new job is, looking at how we solve that, I suppose, in Wales, to make sure that there is parity, really. But it all comes down to whole school systems more than ALN systems.
Well, and I think that that it reiterates what you were saying earlier about ALN not being a bolt-on. It's sort of embedded within the approach of the school. So sort of picking up on what you've just said about consistency and data, etc., and thinking about your new role. So I understand you've been travelling across Wales, looking at provisions, in a range of different settings. What are your thoughts regarding how to ensure consistency across Wales in the availability of resources in the language of choice for learners?
Yeah, and I think I literally, as you've just said, I've just finished basically a tour of Wales. I've seen dozens and dozens and dozens of schools and talked to dozens of people. And what I'm finding is, yeah, there's no consistency across the country. Um, and people across Wales are creating their own resources. Um, I'm not saying they're not good, but then there's no quality assurance for them. Teachers are just doing what they think is right, and they've got to do it because that's all they've got.
Mm.
And one thing I've noticed is that people don't share. So, for example, a school or a local authority up in the north, I'm going to pick one at random. I'm not saying I've seen anything good or bad in this local authority. For example, Flint might have something really good going on, but are a bit cagey about sharing it further. And someone in Powys or Carmarthenshire want something like that, but don't know it's available. I think that's quite a big problem. And it's a huge issue, really, because the code states, doesn't it? And I've got the quote here. So, additional learning provision for a person aged 3 or over means educational training provision that's additional to, different from, made generally available to those in Wales. So, it's got to be consistent across the country. We've got to know what's going on north, south, east, west. So Wales has always worked in those pockets, and we need to change that mindset. I find that's going to be quite a difficult job. We've never had a national approach to Welsh medium provision. So the big job is identifying good practice, sharing it, and identifying the gaps and plugging them with commissioning new resources and things like that. And I think that everyone is asking for data, something that can track data, and things which are research led, which is more complicated again, because how would you do that without spending thousands of pounds?
Yeah.
So it's quite a difficult picture at the moment, and some early days in the role. I've got to try and formulate a plan over the summer now.
I think, yeah, I agree that that's been a call that's been voiced for several years, hasn't it? But yeah,
Yeah.
maybe you've got an opportunity now, Tristan, to change it.
Oh, we've got to have the money to support it. This is the
Well,
problem, isn't
yeah,
it?
that's
So
true.
we hope it's there.
I think changing mindsets is a step forward, isn't it? Because if you change people's attitudes and their approach, and we're working on a national program where we've got 7 universities working together, so
Yeah.
it can be possible, I suppose. So I'm changing tact again now. I'm jumping around a bit. So Florian, who's an academic based up in Scotland, and she's done a lot of work around the training of teachers and understanding of inclusion. So she states that supporting class teachers to extend what is generally available to everybody rather than including all students by differentiating for some is an important shift in thinking that can avoid negative effects of treating some students as different. So just a thought from you really about how do we encourage that move from differentiation to inclusion?
This is another culture change, isn't it? It's all about culture changes at the moment, and I think the new act is that's what it's trying to do. I think my teacher training, additional need or special need as it was then, and differentiation was that extra couple of sheets of paper for someone, or basic differentiation. But why does it have to be that? Things like children who have got, let me think, an ADHD type, a concentration type need, things that would support them would be things like fiddle toys, or the task written down on a whiteboard, things, movement breaks. So why can't we do that as part of our teaching? Wouldn't that help
Mm,
everyone? So it's that
mm,
culture change, isn't it? If a child needs work on yellow paper, why can't everyone have it on yellow paper? It's not different then. So there's a lot of things that are very, very easily fixed. Um, I think, what was I going to say then? So it's got to be led by whole school approach. It's got to come from the teaching and learning leads. That all these things are really, really easily achievable. And it's most of them are quick wins. So it's not more. It's. I think teachers think it's more work to differentiate for a child. Where I disagree. I think it's easier because you're doing the same for everyone. Just it looks different, less text on a page. That's a simple thing to
yeah.
fix for everyone, isn't it?
Mm, mm,
Um,
And I think, I suppose, we on this call need to model that as well.
Yeah,
And maybe that, it comes from PGC training, that is modeled in the PGC training, and then
yeah.
it's embedded within practice. So as you said earlier, it's not a bolt on, it's sort of just part and part of everyday practice.
And that's in a way, that's what the new curriculum was supposed to do, or is
Mm,
supposed to do. I think primary schools, and this is a very sweeping statement, please don't shoot me, but I think primary schools are more used to that style of teaching. And I think secondary schools find it more difficult. And that's because of the timetables, the specialisms. We've still got to teach science GCSE. It's a very different way of, and how does that marry together? I think the key thing for inclusion is the predictability, though, the class of the teacher, of the school. I think schools
mm,
need to do a lot of work on that. If that was right, they'd solve a lot of things. Um, Another thing, inclusion-wise, I would say answering questions in class. How many of those children hate putting their hands up? Is there another way of getting feedback from the children, which instead
mm,
of the child breathing for an hour thinking they're going to ask me a question, they're going to ask me a question. If there's a way that everyone can get involved and technology can help with that, I suppose, with whiteboards, it's simple things like that which are going to
mm,
help those children. Because
mm,
it's not necessarily an additional lead as such. Sometimes it's just the way the class is structured. Does that
yeah.
answer your question, Rhiannon?
Yeah, it does. I did think of something else and I've forgotten it now. But anyway, I'll come back to it. Um, so I think this relates back to something you were saying earlier about having everybody involved in discussions and, asking learners for their opinion. Uh, I think maybe for people working in settings, maybe special school settings, where engaging that learner voice can be challenging. So I
Okay.
just wondered if you got any ideas about how you could ensure learner voice is heard when hearing it might be challenging.
When you say hearing it might be challenging, sorry, I took that as it might
Yeah,
be something really negative.
yeah, that as well. Yeah, I'm rereading. Yeah, that's what I mean. Where it might be something we don't want to hear or we
Yeah.
can't respond to appropriately, or yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a normal day-to-day job, isn't it? That's part of what we do as senior leaders. We're not going to like everything we hear, but sometimes it is the right thing.
Mm,
And it's a culture shift again. Change is really, really challenging. And sometimes you need to be told by a child that's not right. You shouldn't do it like that. And we should listen.
mm,
Sometimes, though, you've got to filter the truth from maybe a grudge that that pupil has got with a
mm,
member of staff. So it's being logical and being practical and thinking about it. If there is a concern or something that is picked up, I think conversations with the child further, with the family, just to see what's going on. If it's something within the school, to see what's been said. Children tend to complain home a lot, and you can get more information from that. And then do something about it. If there's
mm,
something practical you can change, do something about it, but keep the children informed. I'm doing this.
mm,
It's going to take. It might take a year for me to change this, but this is the steps. These are the steps I'm taking. And even if you can't change what's going on, that you inform why that is. Sometimes you
mm,
can't say everything, but you've got to just be honest with the children. They're not silly. They're not stupid. Children understand. They see more than anyone. Um,
mm, mm.
so they need to be kept informed. But again, a learner isn't always right, which is something
No.
we got to remember.
But I think it's important to keep those channels of communication open,
Yeah,
even if they're not right, but they understand, that you've actually listened to them,
yeah,
and you've responded. It might not be what they want to hear, but actually you have responded and you can explain that to them.
yeah.
Mm. Um, what do you think are the benefits and challenges of ensuring whole school or whole setting consistent excellence in practice?
Yeah, benefits with the ALN code. It's a shift in teaching and learning. Teaching and learning, I think, if people have really embraced the new code, has improved significantly.
Mm,
Because, well, the what was told to schools when the code was coming into effect was that if you could support a child in a school, it didn't necessarily need to be an ALN. I'm not saying that's the correct way. I think this is a contentious issue at the moment, but
mm,
that's what we were told 2, 3, 4 years ago. So what we did as Elenco was we made sure that the teaching and learning quality was raising, so we didn't have as many ALN IDP children. So that's definitely improved in schools who've done it right. I think increased buy-in from staff. Once you've got those things in place and the quality of teaching and learning, the behaviour is better, so the buy-in of staff increases as well. I think it's quite important that the staff realise that ALN pupils are not a minority anymore. They are a significant proportion of every classroom. So that is a benefit. Again, if it could be a negative thing as well, because people don't realise it. But my experience, it's a good benefit that staff are starting to realise who are in their classes, and it's not teaching from the shelf. It's producing lessons which are relevant to those in front of you. And I think one massive bonus and benefit is that SLT are more involved with it. It's not that school and ALN is over there. It's all one big picture now. And if you get it right, that's really a positive shift. Some of those things, though, if it's not done right, are all the negative and the challenges as well, isn't it? So it depends on your setting, I suppose. I think challenges in general, though, money, and that's a national problem. And I think I was reading, it happened to be how much Cardiff Council have got to save next year. It was in the news yesterday, 50 million they've got to save in 25-26. It's not peanuts, is it? It's a lot of money they've got to save, and schools are going to be affected by that. Then the staff, and I'm talking about all levels of staff, teaching and teaching assistant, their availability. Teachers are getting rarer and rarer. I think this year they were trying to appoint a lot of staff in the school where I was just before I left. They just couldn't get bums on seats. They couldn't find the teachers. They weren't available. And that's a scary place to be as a profession. And then when you've got them, sometimes you've got to just have a bum on seat, and the quality then is a problem. So then it comes back to quality of teaching and outcomes and all that stuff then. So how can you ensure quality and excellence then? When you haven't got the selection of the staff in the first place? That goes across teaching assistants as well. But things like they're struggling to appoint head teachers as well. So I think the whole profession is struggling at the moment with staff. The reasons behind that, I'm not going to go into.
I think it's an international problem as well. It's not just.
Oh, is it?
Yeah. From what we had somebody talking from Australia last week, and they've got similar issues. I'm not sure to what extent, but I think it is an international problem, the recruitment of teachers. But yeah.
Wow, that's interesting, isn't it? I didn't know that. I think one of the challenges is as well the staff buy into different ventures and ALN and all of it really, because they're drowning in bureaucracy. They've got classes of 34, some of them, and imagine all the assessment, the teaching, the learning, the planning, the timetables are maxed out. They haven't got the brain capacity to think differently, and sometimes you've got to take them out of a situation and say, right, what's going on, and just show them there's an easier way to do certain things. You need that sometimes. I always say the way I process my day and things I've got to do is I go for a long walk or go to the gym. I know I don't look it, but that's how I process the information. Some people don't have time to do that, and they need that time. Those are the main things, I think, benefits and challenge wise.
Yeah. And we really appreciate everybody on the call who's given up their Saturday. They're doing this on top of their day job, which, as you've outlined, is very stressful, very full on. And that time for reflection is really important, isn't it? Just to think about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you're planning to do next. So we have got some aspiring ALNCOs and practitioners here. So I don't know, have you got any advice to give them in achieving excellence in ALN practice? Some top tips, maybe, Tristan, so they can take away and think about it next week before they finish.
Yeah, well, I think number one, an ALNCO, what is the word? Additional learning needs coordinator, not an additional learning needs doer. And I learned this the hard way. you don't do everything yourself. You coordinate, you get other people to do it. It's delegation. Things like, I'll use the referral to neurodevelopmental services, for example. Why does the Elenco have to do it all? There's people in that school who will know those children better, heads of year, form tutors. What I was doing was training people to do these various pieces of paperwork, so the information was far better and far more high quality for the relevant people as the NHS in that instance. But really, really important that you learn to delegate, or you'll drown very, very quickly. I think the child should be at the center of everything we do. Like the question you asked earlier, the learner, you've got to listen to them, what's going on, listen to the pupil voice. I think making sure you ensure those links with families. Be on the phone. I think you should use a lot of your day phoning families of the younger children in the school. You're 7 in my case, making sure you've got those quality links there. That will support you as you move through the school, because they will trust you and they will contact you about everything, which is a good thing. What have I written down here? So ensuring it's a whole school ethos. If you're in a school where it's not, that is a big challenge. You've got to get that right. Things like differentiation would be landed at the door of the Elenco. It's not. It's teaching and learning. It's got to be a whole school ethos. Training, get yourself trained, understand, work with your local authority, work with local clusters, local schools, get your training, understand what you're doing. Get a WhatsApp group working with clusters of people so you know who to talk to. Ask. There is never a stupid question in this job, never ever, because things change so quickly. Paperwork changes, systems change, needs change. There is never a stupid question. And listen to your staff and be supportive. They will be struggling, some of them. Try and be supportive and give them a cup of tea and listen. That goes a long way. And I'm not talking just about your team of staff. I'm talking about the whole school staff. They sometimes come to you as a person they feel they can turn to. I don't know why that is within the Lanco normally. And then, yeah, I said the last one there was the delegation. You've got to learn to delegate quickly. It's not all your job.
I think there's some really useful tips there, Tristan. Maybe not just for ALNCOs, but people in management, I suppose, in understanding you don't have to take the whole job on. You delegate and, work as a team that way. How do you feel about the proposition that inclusion is a good idea in theory, but not good for all in practice?
I agree. I agree fully with that. I am assuming in that proposition that we're talking about inclusion being children all being in a mainstream school. I think it's important that that is the case, but that's not always necessarily the case. But if you've got all the things I've talked about already, your teaching and learning, your school ethos, all of that right, and a child is really still struggling, I think you've got to consider specialist placement for those children, but it shouldn't be your first thought. It should be a very last resort. So it's difficult, isn't it? Because there also might be contextual issues within the school, issues within peer groups, within staff and pupil relationships, not necessarily an additional need. So you've got to explore the whole thing, and there will be difficult conversations somewhere along the line normally. And having those conversations with parents is difficult in itself, but you've got to do everything in your power to make it work. But it isn't always possible. So some of the pupils potentially that it's not possible, those who are whose ability will make them struggle, specific difficulties in the sense of maybe a medical difficulty. I'm avoiding using terms because some people with a condition might really strive in a mainstream school, but you've got to know your children, and really it's the last resort. One of the things I've noticed more recently is the anxiety, the ABSA pupils are struggling more and more. And they will never get into a school. If they can't get into a class with 30 children, they'll never get into a school with 1,200. So they need something more specific, bespoke. And it's not necessarily a specialist setting, it's just somewhere smaller. So maybe links with local schools who are smaller might be something you can do instead of a specialist setting. But sometimes it's not possible. And you've got to think of the other options.
There are challenges there as well, aren't there, in terms of limited spaces, and having to apply to these special schools, and there aren't any spaces for the children. So it could be, can be quite a difficult process, can't it, for individuals?
Yeah. But for a school, I suppose, if you make that application, that if you're making that application to say we actually can't do this anymore, this child is not going to make any progress,
Mm,
it's flagging it up to the local authority. And I suppose if they kind of agree but say they haven't got space, that's their responsibility to find a space
mm,
for that child, then, in my opinion.
mm.
Because we can't just say a child that hasn't got a space. I
No,
think it's
no, yeah,
morally wrong.
no, I agree. I agree. Um, so finally, I just wondered, we talked about working with multi-agencies, working with parents, and listening to individual voices, so people from the different stakeholders, I suppose. How can individual voices then contribute to cohesive, excellent practice? And do you think there are challenges in ensuring this, especially when working with multi-agencies and parents in particular?
I think it's key to excellence in practice, isn't it? The multi-agencies, because you're working in a school, you know what you do, but sometimes you don't see the problems. I
Mm,
used to use people like education psychologists to come and sit in certain areas of the school and say, what's going on there? Tell me what you see. For example, in a specialist setting, to see how can we improve that. The NHS staff, occupational therapists, have done the same with them. They've sat and just observed from a distance and given me the information. It's not easy sometimes, but it does improve what you're doing. Um, that's more of a strategic thing, but I think from an individual pupil perspective, I think the new system, and one of the many benefits of the new system, is the person-centered practice. I haven't mentioned that yet. And sitting in those meetings is such a positive experience where everyone's just honest and say
mm,
what the child needs. But sometimes what is said can help other pupils as well. Um, I think you've got to do it, and you've got to learn and listen from it. Also, sometimes pupils won't talk to teaching staff, so you've got to understand who that pupil will talk to. Sometimes will be someone in the NHS, and you've got to have their view through that process as well. But all those voices, you've got to listen to them. You don't have to do anything with it, but you've got to listen,
mm,
because it will improve what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. And I think those types of people will be in other schools as well, so they'll be sharing good practice as well as they're traveling around the city or traveling around an area, um, giving so and so school's doing this. Have you tried that? And it does improve practice.
Yeah, I suppose you get to hear different perspective. You get to see a different perspective from what they're telling you, but also they've got that wider experience from working in different settings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you've got to remember, I was in the ALN and Elenco basically for 15 years. In the end, at the beginning of my career, I would have been a little bit resistant to that because I thought I'm doing as best I can. But by the end of it, it was, I'd matured a lot in the role, I suppose. And those
Mm,
voices, they're not being insulting to you, they're just trying to help, and you've got to accept that as well.
mm, mm. So I've come to the end of my questions, and thank you very much for responding to them. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, but I'm also going to encourage, if anybody's got any questions, they can pop them in the chat. Um, and if you want to ask a question, maybe put your hand up or put your camera on and ask Tristan a question.